becomes a curse to these countries. We think that what we see is a retardation of development both economically and politically in these countries. We think that the curse of natural resources hinders these countries' democratization, and we think these countries are held to ransom by multinationals and by dysfunctional governance that is incentivized under the status quo. We think that under our model we are going to get significant and tangible economic and political improvements. So what we are proposing on this side of the House this morning is that firstly, we think the UN will create a fund whereby all money that is generated by the extraction of natural resources in these countries goes into, right? We think that the UN has significant mechanisms to enforce this because we think the UN has significant influence over development and outcomes in the in these poorer countries, and we think that these countries, furthermore, will have an incentive to cooperate with the UN because of the UN's tangible interests in the political development of these countries. But secondly, we think that this money will not be returned to the countries until they've reached a relatively stable level of economic and political development. Once again, we're happy to delegate that responsibility in determining that to the UN. We think that firstly, in particular, we want to see development that is of a long-term and sustainable nature. We think that it's integral that these countries have developed a variety of different industries rather than one. And furthermore, we think that these industries should be those which contribute to the general citizenry. But secondly, we think that where governments are willing to engage with the people and support the rest of their population and aren't under internal threat and are stable, we think that this is a reason where this money will come back to these governments. But thirdly, we think that we are going to provide incentives whereby we will make this model progressive, right? We think that when the UN sees that there is a small degree of significant improvement, right, they're going to give some of this money back, but there will be significant incentive for them to improve in the long term because most of this money will be returned when they reach these goals. So, two issues in this speech today. Firstly, how a model improves economic development. Secondly, how we improve long-term political sustainability. So onto this first issue. We think that economic development should prioritize long-term sustainable development. We think under the status quo, what you have is not this kind of long-term sustainable development. We think that when the focus is primarily on these natural resources, this doesn't happen. We think that, firstly, what happens is that you get this, illusory nature of development that is inherently short-term. But secondly, we think that development should be inherently holistic. So we've got 4 reasons why economic development is, really bad under the status quo. Firstly, this issue of Dutch disease, right? We think that what happens under the status quo is you get, when you get, an economy that primarily focuses on one key export, you generally lose levels of competitiveness across the rest of the country, right? We see that there are very tangible and realistic examples of this happening in the developing world, such as Nigeria in the 1970s, where an oil boom hindered the development and progress of their agricultural industries. Seriously, we think that what happens here is these other industries don't get a chance to develop. We think these other industries, as I'll explain further down, more beneficial to the general citizenry of this country, and we think that this is inherently bad for the long-term growth of this country. But secondly, we think that what the status quo does is it incentivizes reckless spending on the parts of the government, on behalf of the government. We think that this is particularly pertinent in the case of countries that do not have a history of good governments, that do not have this structure of long-lasting, long-standing political bodies, right? We think that there are countless examples in the developing world of countries that have got all their money from resource extraction, spending recklessly, and ultimately finding themselves in billions of dollars in debt in the long term. We think that this leads me to the third issue, that this means that the status quo does not provide for long-term sustainable development, right? Because we think that what happens when your primary focus of a country is resource extraction, right, is that you have a scenario whereby other industries are all but gone. When that resource extraction runs out, because we think that most natural resources are inherently finite, right? You've got all other industries gone. You've got no opportunity for the regeneration of the economy, but also you have these countries in significant levels of debt. And we think that once a country is in that much of a level of debt, it makes it so much harder for them to lead to tangible improvements in social outcomes in this country. But fourthly, we think that what the status quo does is it incentivizes the government not to invest in human capital, right? We think that firstly, these sorts of industries, primary resource industries, are inherently capital intensive, which means that you may need all this complex machinery to operate to extract the resources, but you'll only need one person to operate this machinery, right? So we think that you're not creating a significant amount of employment under the status quo. We think that this incentivizes governments to invest in machinery rather than human capital. We think that investing in human capital is important because like it provides holistic and sustainable development. We think this is particularly good because it allows us to like focus on like improving outcomes like education and health when the government is like investing in real people, in like creating jobs for more people in the country. So onto this second issue of political stability. We think like a general level of political instability seriously hinders like a country's development rather. And we think that like when you have unconditional resource extraction, you can cause a number of problems. Firstly, we think like political inequality and corruption becomes entrenched and becomes furthered. But secondly, we think that there is like an inherent level of political instability. So I've got 4 reasons why this happens under the status quo. So firstly, under the status quo, as I've told you, there is incentive to invest in technology rather than in human capital. We think this is inherently bad for countries that have like traditional like high levels of inequality, traditional systems of like an oligarchy controlling this country where most of the country is like bound in poverty, right? We think that this further entrenches these like class divisions, right? Where like the government is not investing in its broader people. It's investing in machinery that brings money back towards the government, right? We think that there's like less democratization under